This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Zoning controls so much of our cities and our lives, yet it often remains hidden. Architect and attorney Sara Bronin is trying to change that. She spent 7 years as the chair of the Hartford Planning and Zoning Commission and eventually started Desegregate CT, a statewide coalition pushing for zoning reform. Her new book, Key to the City, How Zoning Shapes Our World, goes beyond Hartford and even Connecticut. In it, she unpacks how zoning modes cities and communities across the U.S. Today, she's joining us for the hour from Washington, D.C. Good morning, Sara, and welcome to Where We Live.
Catherine, thanks so much for having me.
So, Sara, I kind of wanted to start this conversation by setting up some scenes for us here. Talking about housing, talking about zoning, very complicated, so many layers. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is zoning?
So zoning is the local regulation of land use. And by land use, it's not just residential versus commercial versus open space, although that's a huge part of zoning. But it's also the regulation of the buildings, their height, their shape, their bulk, and the lots, including the lot sizes, the coverage of the lots, and things like setbacks from the property lines. So I think you could say it's the regulation of land use, buildings, and lots altogether.
And are most people engaged with zoning in their communities day to day, or if they want to, can they? How does that all work, and who's actually sort of the controlling body here?
Well, in many thousands of places across the country, local governments have set up zoning boards that may hear individual zoning decisions, or planning commissions that may advise on the city plan and on zoning. But it's local elected officials that often make the rules for zoning. For the average person, though, zoning can tend to be pretty far removed from their daily experience. Most people probably haven't been to a zoning board meeting. Certainly, there's just a few, maybe thousands of people who across the country who serve on zoning boards or planning commissions. And I think people really only understand or get involved with zoning when there's a controversy or a problem. And I think that should change.
And so with that in mind, too, what got you first interested in the power of zoning? And in your book, because you described growing up in Houston and living in different places, but eventually moving into a cul-de-sac, which is a very different neighborhood. And it was the first time that you have experienced needing to drive everywhere.
As a kid, I don't think any of us ever heard about or thought about zoning, other than maybe my kids who get.
I definitely did not.
zoning conversation at the dinner table. But I think we never, zoning is not something that any of us really intuitively, know about or understand. For me, growing up in Houston, which interestingly is the only large American city that does not have zoning, played a role in really me looking around and saying, why are we driving all the time? And why do we live across the street from a gas station and a strip mall and a nightclub and all of that? So I guess, architecture school was really, and actually the last year of architecture school, when we had to take what we call a professional practice course. I went to the University of Texas at Austin. Every architecture school, you have to take this course, which is about legal contracts as an architect and building codes. And we touched on zoning there. So that really kind of piqued my interest and made me want to keep learning more about these rules.
And we often also talk about the fact that most neighborhoods or places that we live in or areas that people grew up in, it's usually places that you have to get in a car to get from point A to point B. So it's not very walkable. And so can you talk about how do we end up with towns that look like this?
I think so. Zoning first started really about a century ago when the idea became popular after New York City adopted its zoning code in 1916. And other cities around the country started to duplicate that code, which was maybe, I think, 16 pages long, really short. Now it's many thousands of pages long in New York City. But over the decades, we started to use zoning as a power to protect residential areas. That was the notion that zoning has this protective function. And the idea of protection resulted in single family neighborhoods and single family zoning, and also resulted in large lot zoning, where individual housing units were on large individual lots. And I can talk more about some of the stats that we found in studying zoning, but across the country, we see the quote unquote protection of residential neighborhoods being manifest through zoning rules that are single family and large lot across huge swaths of the country.
And when
What that,
go
ahead.
No, continue.
I was just going to say what that means is that the single family neighborhood exists on its own without any other commercial uses, any other small shops or things that people might find useful. And so we end up getting in our cars to drive to those things. And, we are further and further spread apart and really live lives that are not like the historic cities that emerge with all of those things kind of one on top of the other.
Right. And because you mentioned protection earlier of residential areas, are you talking about protection against those commercial uses, or are you talking about protections maybe why am I living next to a gas station, which is probably not great for my health? And that's something that we'll get into later too. But can you just explain more about the protection aspect of it?
So I do think it's that's it, what you said, which is really the protection against any other unexpected uses that might pop up, including commercial uses. So, big picture, the impetus behind zoning was a desire to separate land uses from each other. And 100 years ago, you might have thought, okay, well, this is trying to separate, zoning is for separating polluting factories from residential neighborhoods. And certainly it did have that function. But again, it evolved to it evolved in tandem with this, the rise of the automobile, the idealization of the detached home on a lot with a yard and a lawn and two cars in the garage. And again, zoning evolved really, I think, to with that notion that was the American dream.
Right. Well, and I think we'll discover this further too as we really dig deeper into zoning. And from your book, I've really sort of learned and relearned how zoning is so connected to many different things, and it's very much not a black and white subject. And in your book, you describe zoning as an art as much as it is a science. Can you talk about that more?
Yeah, I mean, I guess ideally zoning is supposed to reflect the desires of a community and also supposed to support a community's vibrant growth and interconnectedness. When you think about the way zoning was adopted 100 years ago, often it was adopted on places that already existed. So 1920 Hartford, for example, 1930s Stanford, these places already existed. And so zoning was overlain on top of cities, sometimes a few hundred years old. And so I think there was adjustments that had to be made and some flexibility, at least with early zoning. Right now, what we have across the country is really, in many places, a one size fits all zoning code that is less about, kind of responding to conditions, less flexible, less concerned about things that we should be concerned about, like public health, like the environment, like transportation systems and how land use patterns relate to those. So those questions, I think, are not really covered in zoning codes now. And I think we should both look at research and data. I guess that's the science side, but also try to think from a human perspective. How are we living, and are our zoning codes doing the best they can for us to live in ways that are fulfilling for us as individuals and as communities?
And I think you also described this whole process. It's sort of like yin and yang, and it involves a lot of balance. And you have a chapter or a portion in your book that talks about the Goldilocks balance. What does this look like? And can you talk about why is it so hard to achieve that balance?
Yeah, I guess not too cold, not too hot, it's
Right.
just right. But so that chapter is actually that chapter starts in Houston, where I've gone back to my childhood home in a neighborhood called Gulfton, again, a neighborhood without zoning, and really just looked around and saw, wow, it's an anything goes situation here. There's El Príncipe Azul nightclub across the street. There's a self-storage facility. There's a gas station, and who knows what else, but that was just on the across the street. And so that's a lack of regulation that is obviously problematic for people who still live in that building that I used to live in,
Right.
and has, again, potentially lots of different negative effects. But then on the other side of it, you go to those neighborhoods that are zoned in the way that I was just talking about, those neighborhoods that are zoned to keep everything out, except for the single family house and detached on a detached large lot. And those neighborhoods sometimes allow for schools or religious institutions to operate as what they call conditional uses or special exceptions. Those are the only things that are allowed in most parts of the country. So that's going too far in the other direction. So that chapter is really about, like, how do we get to the just right point? And part of what we need to think about are the things that we need and use in daily life. So we don't just, live and go to sleep. We, might need toothpaste. We might need a haircut. We might need dry cleaning. We might need a tune-up. I don't know. There's a lot of different things that we might want to have much more conveniently located to our homes. Maybe not so much others. Maybe not the auto mechanic shop, for example. But I think that we could stand to have a little more mixing in many of our communities for residents' convenience, for a more vibrant place, and actually also to allow for people to have home-based businesses in their out of their own homes, because that we see post-COVID that's something that is of interest to many, and something that our zoning codes actually don't really allow.
I'm glad that you mentioned sort of the post peak of the pandemic era, which is something that I do want to get into a little bit later on. But it's interesting because when you were sort of listing those mixed uses, the auto mechanic, getting a haircut, and whatnots, I have these images of these shops sort of popping into my head in the city that I used to cover in California. That I learned a lot about zoning there. I was there for hours and hours and hours of planning commissions, agricultural review boards talking about wanting to revitalize or reform, and also saw firsthand that I think many towns come into zoning reform with really good intentions, but sometimes it just doesn't end up working out. Especially with what you were just saying, Sarah, about that balance. How do you get that just right? I imagine that is very challenging. Can you talk about what's happening here? Why do you think it just sometimes does not end up well when the intentions were good?
Now, do you mean a situation where there's a rezoning for an individual parcel, or there's there's a controversy about a specific site, or do you mean maybe a broader scale effort
I
for
think maybe,
rezoning a neighborhood?
let's start with a broader scale effort.
So interestingly, very few communities have undergone a comprehensive rezoning. Hartford was one of them. There's been a few others, Chicago recently, the last couple decades as well. But cities, by and large, don't generally take their zoning codes and toss them out and redo them. And I think there's a lot of fear around the settled expectations of property owners, about upsetting those settled expectations. And there's a lot of concern that, well, how do we know what's good about what's going to happen? How do we know what's going to happen if we totally change a zoning district? I do think there's a fear of change, and that's human nature. That's something that we see in lots of different regulatory contexts. But when it comes to zoning, we have had so many zoning codes around the country that were put in place in 1950, 60, 70, even the 80s and 90s, which have so many outdated ideas from a structural perspective that they really should be revisited. And so in some cases, when you ask about what kind of reforms or why doesn't reform always work, part of it might be that maybe the lack of audacity, the lack of boldness to completely shift the mindset in a zoning code. And you can do that when you have either elected officials or zoning and planning oriented people in a community that are trusted by a community and that are willing to lead change and can sort of help a community diagnose their problems when it comes to zoning. But if you don't have that, and if you don't have sort of the right mix of political will, of technical capability, and of community support, at least a majority of community support, you won't get that kind of comprehensive reform. I'm a big fan of looking at a zoning code and saying, what kind of city is this creating? And really going back down to the fundamentals. Is this what we want? And thinking about how a zoning code might evolve to better reflect what a community wants.
Right. And clearly, this is such a complicated process and not a one size fit all. And sometimes towns do create zoning with an end in mind. A Connecticut Public recently released documentary, Fighting for Home, How Housing Policy Keeps Connecticut Segregated. We're going to hear a quick clip from the documentary from Trinity College professor Jack Doherty explaining how zoning was designed in West Hartford.
Zoning, by definition, isn't inherently bad. We have all sorts of reasons why we do want to have zoning for public good. For example, you don't want to have a toxic waste factory right next door to a child care center. So those separation of maybe residential, industrial purposes, that makes sense for zoning. That's a progressive value in zoning. But what we're looking at here is exclusionary zoning. That refers to policies that favor more expensive single-family home construction and the people who can afford to live there over more affordable multifamily construction. The town of West Hartford implemented rules that made it uneconomic to build 2 or 3 family homes on a small slice of land. The town wanted single family homes, and the way they got that was to make the rules so that you had to have minimum land requirements per family. And what did that do? That made the rest of the housing much more expensive. And that effectively limited who could afford to come and live in West Hartford.
That was Trinity College professor Jack Doherty, and you can watch the documentary on our website at ctpublic.org. Sara, can you respond to what we heard from him? Are those echoes of similar things that you've been hearing about, witnessing? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so Professor Doherty is a great expert on zoning, and the interest in West Hartford. It's. I mean, I know that there's been a lot of discussion about that town, and I mean, just using it as an example, discussions at the local level about how to rezone and how to attract more diverse people to the city, more diverse types of housing in particular. If you look at West Hartford's current zoning, you can see developments like Blueback Square emerging. You see new apartments that are being built around the Connecticut Fast Track line. But the way that the zoning code is written, if you look at, I have a project called the National Zoning Atlas, and you can look at any town in Connecticut because it was the first state to be done, and click on how much land allows for single family homes. And while he was talking, I just did that. And 92% of West Hartford allows for single family housing. And under 1% allows for apartment buildings as of right, which means without a public hearing and other sort of process rules. It's, at least according to our map, it's about 11 acres of 9,763 zoned acres. Wow. So those stats suggest that although you're seeing a lot that's being built in West Hartford, probably a lot of it is subject to a lot of reviews, public hearings, the kinds of things that we've seen in communities across the country that tend to slow down the production of multifamily housing, really make sure it's maybe compatible with surrounding buildings and neighborhoods. And to West Hartford's credit, again, a lot of those housing units have been permitted through the process that they have. That's not necessarily true in other Connecticut suburbs. I think many Connecticut suburbs have similar stats to West Hartford up in the 90s when it comes to the percentage of land zoned for single family housing, and down in the 0, 1, 2% when it comes to multifamily housing as of right. And I don't think that you're seeing the same kind of permissions that are going through the process, even through those public hearing type applications. So I think zoning continues to have just through the words on the page, the text of the zoning codes themselves continue to have these effects. But again, to West Hartford's credit, they have been permitting multifamily housing and hopefully turning the page on some of those old practices.
Right. And I think earlier we touched a little bit about segregation. I think oftentimes when we're talking about housing and zoning, that's often brought up. And can you talk about how much is segregation tied to zoning? Are they inseparable?
Well, we've done a study actually on what we've seen in Connecticut, specifically the Connecticut portion of the National Zoning Atlas, in collaboration with Urban Institute, which is a DC-based think tank, and found that single-family zoning places which had single-family zoning tended to have residents in those districts that were more white, more wealthy, more educated, and more likely to be homeowners than areas where you might see multifamily zoning. And so, unpack that for a little bit. Those kinds of correlations, the racial and demographic implications of those, are consistent with what many people have said about zoning, which is that it has these the effects of race and income-based segregation. Now, our study couldn't prove causation because we've only collected zoning at a point in time, but we may be able at some point to look back at Connecticut's historical zoning and collect all of that data and run the same study to see if we can find causation. We haven't done that yet, but I think the story in Connecticut about the correlations with racial and demographic outcomes tied to zoning practices are going to very likely hold true across the country.
And we're definitely going to be talking more about the atlas that you referenced to after we come back from the break. But before we do that, I do want to get to this idea that zoning does impact a lot more than just housing. I think when we think about it, we automatically think about infrastructure and housing, but there's also the public health aspects that has an impact. So can you talk about what are some of the health impacts that zoning can have?
Well, in my book, I start with a story of a neighborhood leader, Denise Best in Hartford, who was gracious enough to give me a tour, as I asked many neighborhood leaders to do, their neighborhoods when I first started chairing the city planning and zoning commission in Hartford. Her neighborhood happened to be centered around Albany Avenue, which, as many of your listeners know, is a high-speed 4-lane it's a state highway, and it was designed and expanded to help bring commuters from the western suburbs into downtown where they worked, particularly after many residents moved out of Hartford during the 50s and 60s into those outer lying suburbs. Because of the approach of city leaders, maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago, to focus on Albany Avenue as an auto-oriented corridor to serve those commuters and suburban residents to get them quickly to their downtown destinations. Denise and her neighborhood had suffered a lot. The zoning required Albany Avenue to be or at least allowed for Albany Avenue to have gas stations and car washes and fast food drive-throughs, really, again, car-oriented uses. What happened as a result is lots of cars use Albany Avenue. It's very convenient for them. And the pollution from those cars has in part contributed to Denise's neighborhood having some of the highest asthma rates in the country. the fact that there's so much fast food and not a lot of other kind of sit down restaurant options is maybe contributes to food related, diet related health outcomes in the neighborhood where you do see high rates of obesity. I think that many communities which have allowed the kind of development, the strip malls, the gas stations to happen in their commercial areas and in that case in Albany Avenue, cutting through a dense historic neighborhood, one that is largely African American today. But it used to be Albany Avenue used to have these beautiful multi-story brick buildings, and those were all really demolished for these other things that zoning allowed. So instead of having a walkable, well knit together place where Albany Avenue was a very strong core, we've lost some of that over the years. And in Hartford, we reversed that zoning and hope that we banned all of those uses. And we reversed that zoning so that we could restore over time as new development happens that neighborhood. But for me, that single morning that we took that tour, I think drove home for me as an early in my tenure as a planning and zoning commission, that the public health effects of zoning, they're myriad, but in that particular neighborhood, they were really, really stark and something that I think compelled us to reshape the zoning code to change it.
When we come back from the break, we're going to continue all things zoning with Sara Bronin. She's the former chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission in Hartford and also founder of Desegregate CT. And for our listeners, let us know if you have any questions or comments about the housing or zoning around where you live. We definitely want to hear from you. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Our guest for the hour is Sara Bronin. You might know her from her work with Desegregate CT, which is a statewide coalition pushing for zoning reform across Connecticut. But that's not all she's done. She's also helped overhaul Hartford's zoning code and later started the city's sustainability office. To Sara, better zoning starts with getting better data about zoning. In the U.S., there are thousands of different zoning codes, and Sara's working to log them all through the National Zoning Atlas. So, Sara, earlier you mentioned the National Zoning Atlas a couple of times. Can you tell us a bit about how does it work? What is it? Because it seems like a lot of information. I actually used it yesterday to look up certain towns in Connecticut and learned a lot.
So this project aims to, what we say, digitize, demystify, and democratize information about zoning codes. And it really did grow out of the Desegregate Connecticut work, because when we went out to communities and talked about how zoning had some of the effects that Professor Doherty mentioned and had contributed to a wide variety of problems in Connecticut, people asked us, well, how do you know that? How do you know how Bristol zones? How do you know how Goshen zones? How do you know how Essex zones? And the truth is, we didn't have a good answer because we hadn't read all of the codes that Connecticut offers, not just 169 zoning codes, by the way. A couple towns, Bethlehem and Eastford, don't have zoning, but actually 183, because Connecticut gives powers to zone to private associations, a couple of beach associations, as well as boroughs within certain towns. What we did, because people asked, was we actually went out, gathered all the zoning codes, read them, about 33,000 pages of zoning codes, and extracted information about each zoning district. So every town that has zoning has a number of zoning districts. So Andover, for example, has 5 zoning districts. Bridgeport, Hartford, New Haven have more like 40 or 50. So we took information about each of these, we put them on the map, and we allowed people to explore their own towns, including what I just did with West Hartford, the ability to see within your town where single family housing could be constructed, where apartments can be constructed, where accessory dwelling units can be constructed. With that information in Connecticut, we were able to inform both statewide legislation that passed within the first year of Desegregate Connecticut's existence, but also local changes that have been made in communities across Connecticut. What happened after that was that other people caught wind of this tool, which we built in collaboration with Connecticut Data Collaborative, and they wanted to replicate it. So I wrote up the methodology that we used in Connecticut. Our GIS expert, Ilya Ilyanku, wrote up the GIS portion so people could make their own maps, and Montana and New Hampshire quickly followed. And now we have an updated methodology, and we are centralizing data across the country on zoning. And the fundamental question we want to answer is, how does each American community zone? And also, how many communities across the United States actually have zoning? Since there's never been a data collection effort like this, we really don't know which communities have zoning and which ones don't. And our analysts, and I have about 20 people working on the full-time National Zoning Atlas team, are painstakingly going from state to state. We've done work in about, I think, 30 states and have about 5,000 of the maybe 30,000 communities with zoning mapped online. And we just put up a few of the big cities. We've done Phoenix and all the major Houston, San Antonio, Dallas metros. Of course, Houston doesn't have zoning. Nashville, Washington, D.C., and we've done several full states, including with partners, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Hawaii, and we're working to finish Colorado and others very soon.
So my brain is currently exploding with all this data that's available out there for me to scroll through.
No, don't explode.
In a good way. I imagine there are a lot of people out there, including myself, who likes to look at maps and just kind of figure out where you're at, how the city looks like, how does it work. For me, it's always a firm reminder of where things are or things that I thought were at this place and I was completely wrong. And I can imagine that without this data, it'd be really hard to change zoning. And I think a lot of us might see problems in the ways maybe our neighbors, our neighborhoods are set up, but it's hard to articulate without having an understanding on how something is planned, which is what we've been talking about really throughout this hour. How has this atlas changed the way zoning is perceived, would you say? Like, are you seeing that change already? I know work is still ongoing, but what are you hearing?
I think a lot of people, when their community gets posted to the map and they learn about it and see their community, they're often surprised. In some cases, they're pleasantly surprised that their community has a lot of different uses allowed, a lot of different types of housing allowed. But in many cases, they're shocked at how little new housing, in particular, their community allows. I think cumulatively, the National Zoning Atlas will help expose how these local rules in the aggregate work to thwart the creation of housing in a way that has national effects. And so we're seeing right now in the presidential campaign, housing production is an important issue that's rising to the top, and both of the leading candidates are talking about housing. And zoning, again, a lot of people don't think about zoning. It's this hidden power that shapes a lot of what we do, but they're not necessarily looking at zoning. And the Zoning Atlas, by the way, I should say it's online at zoningatlas.org for anybody who wants to follow along while listening. But the Zoning Atlas is really helping people to understand how it works. And the stats are pretty amazing. Some of the things that we found. So we finished, for example, when we finished Connecticut, we learned that 91% of Connecticut allows for single family housing through zoning, 2% allows for multifamily housing. We've seen that hold true in other states. One of the places that really surprised me, though, was the Denver area. And we're working right now primarily like on metro areas. So Denver and its, I don't know, maybe 50 towns, cities, counties within the Denver metro. We've logged all of those. And we found that 98% of land in that metro area requires a 2-acre minimum lot size for housing. Wow. So we think of Colorado as being this place where everybody's pro-environment, and it's sort of this wonderful place for people who want land conservation. But the zoning in the entire Denver metro area is completely at odds with that, because 2-acre minimum zoning requires people to sprawl outward. It requires the degradation of forests and farmland, and it eats up land that should be conserved. I think there's a big narrative out there that large lot zoning is really good for open space. The opposite is true. What large lot zoning, as Professor Doty was describing, how much land we have for each housing unit, the bigger that gets, the more we're forced to push outward into these areas that we really shouldn't be developing in. And so we're at this, again, our zoning is forcing us to do things that are bad for the environment, and the Atlas is exposing that. So I'm hopeful that it will help to support really significant changes in the way we think about our land development and how zoning effectuates that, because again, it dictates all of these decisions, and maybe we just haven't thought about it. We set it and forget it. We adopt the zoning codes and don't update them. But I think we need to really take a careful look at zoning to make sure it's accomplishing what we want.
Well, I have so many questions about all of the things, but one of the big things I did want to touch on is because you mentioned the environment and how much land is being used to build these properties. Because in your book, you also focused a chapter on the role that nature plays into planning. So what do we need to do to start thinking more about when it comes to opportunities to build green, especially clearly there's a need for it?
So yeah, I mean, in the book, I talk a bit about I talk a lot about large lot zoning, but I also use a couple of examples out in Arizona, the zoning in Tucson, which, if anybody's been there, it's in the Sonoran Desert. It's very dry, and Scottsdale, which is a suburb outside of Phoenix, and the two zoning codes have very different approaches when it comes to something pretty mundane, probably for most people, which is landscaping. So Scottsdale requires residents to maintain green lawns. Tucson, by contrast, requires residents to not have lawns at all, but instead to have what you might call xeriscaping, maybe more cactus and rock-oriented landscaping, more in line with a desert, right. But landscaping that doesn't use as much water. So in those two contrasting zoning codes, you can see a totally different approach to managing water, one which encourages wasteful water use in lawns, the other which does not. And the two cities' water usage is totally different. And again, that's something that's enforced through zoning. So I think that beyond just the aspect of sprawl, the low density subdivision issue, that the sort of detached single family large lot, there's a whole bunch of other aspects of zoning codes that have really significant impacts on the environment, and not only the environment, but also our ability to maintain farmland as farmland. Another example, just thinking about sort of the environmental issues, are things like solar panels, things like stormwater runoff. Those strategies are to make buildings and communities more sustainable, are sometimes facilitated by zoning. So in Hartford, for example, we have pretty liberal rules on solar energy, and we have stormwater management rules. But in other places, those things are thwarted. So some places completely ban visible solar energy, solar collectors. And that's problematic if we want for us as a country to really be able to have a climate response.
Well, we're going to continue our conversation about zoning with Sara Bronin after a quick break. She's here to talk about her new book, Key to the City, How Zoning Shapes Our World. You can find links to Desegregate CT and the National Zoning Atlas on our website, sctpublic.org/wherewelive. Coming up, we'll hear about her current work on the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. Join the conversation. Find us on Facebook and Twitter @wherewelive. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Our guest today is Sara Bronin. She's the founder of Desegregate CT and is currently serving as 12th chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. Her new book is Key to the City: How Zoning Shapes Our World. So Sara, we'd love to get an idea of what it's like being a part of the Council on Historic Preservation. How do you connect this back to your work in housing?
Oh, thanks for asking. And that this is a totally separate topic. But so I currently chair the Federal Historic Preservation Agency called the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And over the last couple of years that I've been in this role, I've really tried to think about how, as a federal policy advisor on historic issues, our council can update both federal policy and also, I think, preservationist thinking as a whole as to how we might treat a number of issues. And for me, as you probably guess, some of my key concerns as a human being are access to housing and people's ability to access housing, and our climate response, and are we doing enough to deal with climate change? Those two issues are really interrelated. And actually, I think our historic communities have a role to play in addressing both of them. For a long time, preservationists have been some of the leading creators of affordable and accessible housing, because rehabbing a building for housing is often less expensive than building a new building. And because preservationists tend to be pretty creative, especially preservation developers. You look at some of the developers in Hartford, for example, the people who renovated the Bank of America building downtown, the Colt Factory, the other buildings around Capewell. I mean, there's so many around the city, especially from industrial use to housing. And all of those were historic buildings that were repurposed. The Advisory Council over the last last year really has identified these as issues and has updated, and we voted as a full council, a housing policy statement that was maybe not as bold as this one, and a policy statement on climate change and historic preservation. And in both of those statements, we recognize that preservationists have had a leading role. On the carbon side, building reuse is a carbon-friendly activity. Again, housing rehab is something that preservationists have long done, and sort of pledged to be more active in conversations about zoning. And so I've used in my role the policy statement to advise a number of cities, which is consistent with our congressional mandate as a council, on even things like zoning. So I was down in Charleston, which is a largely historic city, and I also testified in New York City about the City of Yes proposal, which has a number of provisions that will both protect and preserve historic neighborhoods and historic buildings by allowing them to be reused for housing. And that's really, I think, the goal, and preservationists do need to be active in those conversations.
Well, I think it's so fascinating how historic preservation and housing, current housing, really is so interconnected, especially in a state like Connecticut, where we have so many historical districts and houses. And so for people who want to get involved with zoning and housing committees around where they live, what advice would you give them on how to get involved? Because I think when people hear the words like committees, agencies, they might get a little intimidated. What are your thoughts?
It's really hard for, I think, people to understand how to access, how to engage with local zoning. And that's a problem. Oftentimes, these meetings happen at inconvenient times of the day, and they may not be publicly noticed, and something that might be really important on the agenda might not get enough attention. And so I think, one way for people to get involved is really to show up at a meeting or two, kind of get a sense of what it's like, if that's possible, but also to just check out their zoning code, kind of see how their community zones, and use some of the tools that are available from a number of different groups, including Desegregate Connecticut. If you're in Connecticut, there's that's that organization, by the way, is a program of the Regional Plan Association. So after I had to step down due to my federal role, I the Regional Plan Association picked it up, so you can visit their website or desegregateCT.org, and there's a whole category of brochures, of reports called Be the Change. And, again, for listeners in Connecticut, checking those out, which I think do a really good job of translating maybe esoteric zoning terms for people who are not as familiar, talking about the kinds of things that you as an individual might be able to ask your zoning board to consider, ask your elected officials to consider, and providing some tips about how to access local commissions and to understand zoning, including through the Zoning Atlas. I think those are really good documents for Connecticut. Broader readers have lots of opportunities to do that too. In Massachusetts, Abundant Housing MA does something. In New York, Open New York has a lot of resources. And then YIMBY Action in general, a large nationwide nonprofit, also has tools. So increasingly, there's information about how to get involved. But I do think it starts with interrogating what's happening in your own community and figuring out how you can access those decision makers and those meetings, which I think are a great time, but some might find a little boring.
Well, we hope we presented this in a way that our listeners will also find it to be a great time. I did find the National Zoning Atlas to be really, really easy to use and super fascinating to see just the area around where you live. So definitely recommend it to maybe pique your interest about zoning. And we've got about 30 seconds here, Sara, but want to get some final thoughts from you. What do you hope our listeners get away from this conversation today?
I hope listeners I hope we've piqued an interest in zoning in your listeners. And I hope, everybody goes out and, again, really starts to understand why this power of local governments is so important, how it shapes our lives, and to pick up on some of the desire for change, and to, really talk with your neighbors about whether your zoning code is meeting your needs.
Well, thank you so much for helping us understand all of that better. Sara Bronin, you can find her link to her book on our website, ctpublic.org/where we live. Thank you so much, Sara, for being with us today.
Oh my gosh, thanks for having me and for covering zoning.
Absolutely. We're helping make zoning sexy to talk about. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much for listening, and happy learning about zoning.